Hello, I'm Stephen Burke. I'm a visual artist from Dublin in Ireland. And just first, I'd like to say thank you to Peter and Cleo for organising this talk, and thanks to Hugh Lane for having me. So I come from a background in graffiti, and while this isn't something that I participate in that much anymore, it's still something that I'm really passionate about. And it's something which has quite significantly influenced the art that I focus on now, which is public related art and intervention art. And kind of at the crux of the work that I'm making at the moment is art that questions the cultural divide between the street and the gallery. And what I mean by that is we don't look at things in public space with the same creative or critical lens as we do when we go to a gallery. And I just think that's quite unfortunate because there's so many things in public space that carry the same characteristics as things we might see in a gallery. But because of the context and authorship, we don't look at them in the same light. And with my work, I play on this. So I'm just going to show you a quick few slides. So two kind of elements of public space that I'll introduce today are graffiti removal and tactile paving. So these two elements are something that I've been concentrating on for the last wee while. And this is just a quote that I thought was particularly relevant to art and public space. So erasure is merely a matter of making things disappear. There's always some ditch strewn about in the aftermath, some reminder of the violence done to make the world look new again. Brian Dillon. So the first topic I'm going to introduce is buffing, which is a slang term for graffiti removal. It's defined as the erasure of graffiti by painting over, chemically removing, or pressure washing. I know it might sound ironic to have an interest in graffiti removal when you come from a graffiti background, but pretty quickly I was noticing that the buffs I was seeing around Dublin were very similar to a lot of the art history that I was learning about in art school in NCD at the time, particularly abstract painting. So on the left here is very classic example of a buff that I photographed behind the Jervis Centre in Dublin City Centre. And on the right is a painting by Agnes Martin. And initially, it was just an aesthetic acknowledgement that there was pretty amazing similarities between the two. But again, the kind of differentiation between them was really the context and the authorship. One is presented in museums and galleries, the other is presented on a side street. And again, just an example of the similarities between buffing and abstract painting. On the left, we have a series of buffs in London. And on the right, we have a painting by Mark Rothko. So this is a photo I took in Tala in 2016 of two buffs on the side of someone's house. And around this time, I started working with an Irish photographer, Fiachra Corcoran, and we collaborated on a project and made a book called Buff. It's a very creative name, I know. And with this project, we wanted to document graffiti removal around Dublin and kind of do a bit of research in it and kind of find some meaning in it. And when we did a bit of kind of research into the topic, we found out there's quite a few people abroad who've been looking at it. And one such artist is Avalon Callan, an American guy who'd been researching it since the early 90s. And he had really gone quite deep into kind of the meaning of it and kind of differentiating the different aesthetics involved. And he came up with a categorization system for buffing. And he made three different categories. The first of which is conservative, which you can see two examples of conservative buffs in this photo. And thought it was a really good idea to do something like that because it makes these buffs no longer just random shapes of the wall. You know, they're differentiated, but they're differentiated depending on their kind of appearance now, and it just gives them a bit more significance. So yeah, conservative buffs are typically square or rectangle, and they are usually a tone lighter or tone darker than the initial wall color. So yeah, it pretty much does what it says in the tin. And next category that Avalon came up with was ghosting, which is a little bit more technical. And this is where the removalist traces around the graffiti with emulsion. and essentially kind of makes what was painted a little bit fatter. So not an amazing way to mask the graffiti, but does create kind of interesting and awkward compositions. And the third example that Avalon came up with was radical. So these buffs, it was an interesting idea by Avalon that the removalist kind of shows some kind of creative flair when they're painting these removals, because they don't fit the kind of any reasoning or any kind of guidelines to traditional graffiti removal. So this one's particularly appropriate to Dublin because there is a removalist in the Portobello area who paints clouds over graffiti. I've been calling the cloud buffer for the last probably 6 years. So you can see an example of that in this photo that I took. 3 kind of clouds that are painted over pieces of graffiti. And this is an example of one of his earlier paintings in Portobello again in Camden Row. Yeah, just doesn't really fit the kind of traditional blueprint as to how to remove graffiti, but does create these kind of really, really interesting compositions. And yeah, this is another one that I took during lockdown of some clouds that he painted on a boarded up building. And I would encourage anyone to go down to Camden Row and have a look at these themselves, because they're always quite interesting. And there's always a few floating about. And with the groundwork that Avalon had set with its categorization system, myself and Fiacre wanted to use this framework to develop our own ideas from graffiti removal. And I was working in Tala in 2016, 17. And what I was seeing out there was a lot of these spray painted removals. And what we later kind of figured out was these were related to political or abusive graffiti. And someone basically wanted to eradicate whatever message was painted on the side of their house as quickly as possible. So they'd use a can of spray paint that they might have in their shed to go out and just scribble over it, basically. It kind of creates these quite like erratic and aggressive compositions. And you can probably see a bit of the frustration by the removalist in painting over this kind of text in the appearance of these buffs. And again, yeah, just an example of how these spray painted removals relate to kind of abusive pieces of text. And just the last example of these maltreated removals. So the previous examples that I showed you are quite aggressive and quite mean looking, but I think this kind of aesthetic associated with maltreated removals is quite varied, and they can be quite elegant as well. And you can see elements of the graffiti that was painted before, but it's still quite beautiful almost. And there's a really nice gradient, and I think they begin to relate to paintings by artists like Katharina Grosset or Christopher Wool. And the other removal type that we came up with during our buff project was etched. So these removals are particularly prominent in Dublin because of the commonality of red brick buildings and old concrete walls. And this is where a removal company uses a pressure sprayer at a setting that's a little bit too high, and it actually etches into the surface of the wall ever so slightly. So this is a good example of 2 etched removals in Phibsborough. So if you were to get up close to this wall, you'd see tiny indentations on the wall where little bits of kind of stone and gravel have been knocked out because of the pressure sprayer. And with our book project, we worked with a designer, Eric Steins, who designed our book and also came up with this really interesting kind of visual graph of the kind of statistics that we were seeing in Dublin in relation to graffiti removal. So I think overall we must have documented probably 1,000 incidences of graffiti removal, and we split them up into 6 different areas. So Northside Inner City, Northside Suburbs, Docklands, Southside Inner City, Southside Suburbs, and West Dublin. And what we began to see was certain areas would have greater or lesser amounts of removals. So Northside Inner City had the most, and this can probably be put down to the high number of footfall within this area. which for someone writing graffiti is something that's extremely appealing because they want their work to be seen by as many people as possible. Whereas the Docklands has the fewest removals, and that's probably down to the lack or the smaller population in that area, which makes it a less appealing area for graffiti artists to paint because not as many people are going to see it. And we also began to see within these categories, we also noticed that quite affluent areas would have very few removals, and the removals that they would have are typically conservative and very subtle, whereas more working class areas would have more removals overall, and the removals there are typically more maltreated or ghosting or radical, because it's just property owners that maybe don't have the funds to get a professional team out and just take care of it themselves, which links into a wider idea of crime within those areas as well. And more recent kind of removal type that I've been documenting is these chemical removals. So this is one that I documented in Berlin. And these are created using acidic sprays to strip the paint from the surface of the wall. And then a sponge is used to wipe it clean. But quite often, the residue left over are these kind of gestural kind of compositions. This is another example of a chemical buff that I spotted in the U-Bahn. Made a bit of a mess here. And this is another one that I documented in Elephant and Castle in London very recently. So I actually stumbled across this guy removing this piece of graffiti from the very beginning, and I shot a series of photos documenting the kind of process across. And again, another example of chemical buff on a tarp on the side of a truck in Berlin. So with our buff project, we worked with a couple of graffiti removal teams. The first of which was a professional graffiti removal team, and they used, eco-friendly materials, and they were very professional with all the kind of removals they would do, and they wouldn't leave any trace of anything like what I've kind of shown so far in these slides. And it's quite funny, the removal team that we worked with, I think they have the contract for Dublin City Council now, at least they did when we were working with them. And the removal team that had the contract previous to them was a little bit more amateurish and would paint the kind of compositions that I've shown you so far. And the new removal team, their first kind of port of call was to go and remove all the removals of the previous team. So yeah, kind of weird kind of inception moment. But this guy in the photo is actually part of a construction team. And this is an example of how these kind of more painterly buffs come about. So it was his job to paint this wall on the right. And while I was documenting him, an elderly lady came around, and she lived on that road, and just asked somebody to paint over the graffiti on the gate on the left. And he used this kind of chrome paint to paint it out, make these quite kind of like patchy and blotchy removals. So quite interesting. And while working with these graffiti removal teams, we did get quite inspired to create some of our own buffs. So what you're seeing here is a triptych that we created during buff, these 3 yellow paintings. And yeah, I thought it was we wanted to remove things very carefully, and it was kind of a careful process where we didn't want to paint over anyone who takes graffiti very seriously, didn't want to step on any toes. So we only painted over kind of teenage scrawls or political graffiti, which is otherwise known as WOWO, which stands for writing on walls and objects, and is quite different to the kind of traditional stylized graffiti that is related to hip hop. So this is an example of a triple exposure photo that Fiacra took during our buff project. So just an experiment with layering, basically, in the same way that buffs kind of layer over and mask over graffiti. We wanted to take a series of photos on top of each other to layer the different buffs on top of one another. And another example of these multiple exposure photos. So I think this must be 3 or 4 buff paintings out in public space that we made. that Fiachra documented over one another. So the way this process works is it's one slide of film that stays shut in the camera, and Fiachra can expose it over and over again on top of one another. So it kind of superimposes elements of each photo into one resulting image. And this is an example of another wall painting that I made. Just again, another experiment similar to the kind of multiple exposures. I wanted to use elements of buffing that I was seeing around Dublin and Glasgow at that time, and kind of include them in my own kind of wall paintings. So this is some of the studio work I've been making the last couple of years. This work is related to maltreated removals and a kind of a sanding and a scrubbing technique that you sometimes see to remove paint. So these are emulsion spray paint on wood, on ply. And on the left is that scrub and sand technique that I was saying. And this uses an electric sander and acidic chemicals to erase pieces of text, but it also inadvertently reveals layers of paint beneath the graffiti. And on the right is an example of a piece of graffiti that has been maltreated with spray paint. This is another example of a painting that I made that references chemical removals. And with this work, I began to include elements of public space within the paintings themselves as well. So on the top of the painting is these laser cut spikes, which reference the kind of the top of security fencing that you often see painted with anti-climb paint. So yeah, in the same way that graffiti removal can be quite gestural at times, I was beginning to notice that this anti-climb paint stuff, when it's applied to these spikes, is applied with paintbrushes, and again, really relates to kind of abstract painting accidentally. And if you ever got this stuff in your clothes, it's an absolute nightmare as well. And yeah, the composition at the bottom is created using acidic chemicals to remove pieces of text. And this is a more recent piece of work that I made over in Unit 1 Gallery in London just recently. I was over there for residency. I just finished up a solo show there in the last couple of weeks. But the place that I was living is quite close to Grenfell Tower. So there's a real history of kind of activism in the area, and there's a lot of political graffiti. So there's a lot of maltreated removals because they're quite closely linked to these types of texts that you might see in public space. And yeah, what I was seeing as well is there's a lot of construction going on in the area, and there's a lot of these kind of plastic hoardings on the side of the road that are just a magnet for street dirt and graffiti and fly posting. And when they're cleaned, it's usually a construction guy who goes over with a can of spray paint or maybe a bucket of emulsion and just does his best to mask over the piece of graffiti. And typically this results in really quite, interesting compositions. So this is just an example of something that I saw over there. And these traffic barriers as well, thought were really interesting. Just individually, like in public space, I began to relate them to pop art, and then they began to remind me of Duplo as well, and kind of large children's toys, Lego and stuff like that. So yeah, I thought it was an interesting kind of link with these kind of naive paintings and these kind of childlike objects. And yeah, another example of these hoardings. So this time, a couple of different processes gone into this one: chemical removals, maltreated. And yeah, again, just an example of some of the kind of compositions that I was seeing over in London, and combining them to make these kind of sculptural paintings. So the next topic that I'm going to introduce is tactile paving. So this is a more new topic that I've been looking at the last maybe a year, maybe just over a year or so. And this is an example of tactile paving just before you step on the tube in London. And these kind of raised circles that you see on these tiles are actually a type of braille for visually impaired pedestrians. So these kind of dots are interpreted by foot or by cane. And essentially what this one says is a stop code because there's a steep drop ahead. And yeah, with kind of researching these, I found out that there's many different types of tiles that have many different codes. So this is one of hundreds, I would imagine. But this one is quite common in London because it's the one that you find just before you step on the train. Um, yeah, another example. This one is one that I found in public space. Um, so the coloring of these tiles is actually due to the material on the floor around them. So they want these tactile tiles to be a different color, so it's more noticeable for the visually impaired pedestrian. So these ones are a darkish gray. So you would probably find that the ground around these tiles is maybe a beige or kind of a lighter gray color so that they stand out more. Um, and yeah, these tiles, they were initially invented by a designer in Japan in the 60s. And he got permission to put them in a busy crossroads in Japan, yeah, in the early 60s, I think. And it was quite like an out there idea at the time, but it was a great success, and pretty quickly it was taken and used in the Japanese railway system. Very successful again, and then very quickly it was implemented all across Japan. And it was a great success, and it was really helping visually impaired pedestrians quite significantly. And then very soon after, it was implemented in the States, the UK, Canada, and now these kind of tiles are kind of an omnipresent component of most cities. And yeah, to think what visually impaired pedestrians would have been kind of going through before these is kind of hard to imagine, because what they've done for the mobility of these people is really quite amazing. So this is an example of some utility marks that I documented in London just recently. And I started noticing these because they're appearing on tactile tiles. And similarly to graffiti removal, it began to emerge that this was its own language within itself as well. Um, so so I worked with, or I just asked a couple of construction guys that I saw painting these about kind of what they mean, and tried to decode them a bit. And essentially they're telling me that, yeah, each color is denotes a totally different thing, a totally different pipe or electricity cable. So red marks denote electricity cables, yellow marks are referencing gas pipes. Blue marks are referencing water pipes. So each one has its own meaning and its own kind of purpose. And the reasoning for these marks is in the 70s in the States, there was a building accident where I think they were trying to put down new electricity cables. And this construction team dug into a petroleum pipe, and there was a huge explosion. A lot of people passed away. And since then, they implemented like a kind of a radar system that's used when you're digging in the floor. And they also implemented this kind of color-coded chart, which just helps the construction teams when they're working. So this is a painting that I made that references these tactile tiles and these construction marks. So this is something that I made in Dublin at the beginning of lockdown. So these construction marks they usually appear in areas that are about to be kind of renovated quite significantly, because they're signaling that, you know, if there's new internet cables, new water pipes, new electricity cables going into the ground, there's typically going to be you know, new building in that area going on, new apartments, new houses, people moving into the area. So I was seeing a lot of these construction marks in Grand Canal Dock, which is an area that's experienced kind of rapid redevelopment in the last couple of years. So these paintings are kind of referencing that area. So again, the blue marks reference Water pipes, red reference electricity cables, and the yellow reference gas pipes. And they also, these series of paintings also include pieces of chewing gum, oil, dirt, to kind of accumulate on their surface. And this is another example of a kind of a lesser found tactile tile. These are usually found at overground train stations. And again, it signals stop code to visually impaired pedestrians. And again, yeah, these series of paintings just really features like an accumulation of kind of dirt and elements of public space, like chewing gum and pieces of litter and spray paint. And the final one of the series is this painting that is referencing a construction area that there's clearly going to be a lot of gas pipes going into. And again, yeah, just referencing these kind of this kind of hieroglyphic language by the construction teams that to the average person is completely unreadable, but to them it's a really integral part of the work that they do, and it's an element of communication that's very important in public space that may otherwise be overlooked. And it's the same thing with the tactile tiles. Another element that would typically be overlooked by people it doesn't impact, but it's actually a extremely important element of public space to pedestrians that are visually impaired. So that's it, and thank you very much to the Hugh Lane for having me. Cheers.